Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got a really interesting author to introduce you to tonight who's going to talk about roots and where we come from. Caroline Topperman is our guest, and her memoir is titled Your Roots Cast a Shadow, One Family's Search Across History for Belonging. And it's just recently been issued. And it arises from Caroline's family's move from Vancouver back to her family's homeland in Poland, and encourages all of us to examine the ways in which family histories shape our understanding of ourselves and our society. Caroline Topperman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Your roots cast a shadow. Why did you want to explore your roots?
That's a very long answer. So my family was moved around a lot. They were displaced over the years for many reasons. And I was actually born in Sweden. I grew up in Toronto and moved to Vancouver. And at some point, I just decided that it was really important to see where I was from and to reconnect with my roots and a part of my family that I didn't know.
I understand that one of the things that motivated you was, wanting to write the memoir was seeing police people and comparing them to Nazis?
So not exactly. I actually moved to Poland in 2013, kind of on a whim with my husband. We're both Polish. He was born there, and I had the right to a Polish passport because my family had half of my family, my mother's side, had been basically kicked out in 1968. And I thought it would be a great adventure to go back and see what it was all about there, what was happening. And we happened to land at a time when a new government was being voted in, and a lot of the headlines started being reminiscent of headlines that my grandparents had experienced in the late 1930s before the Second World War broke out. And so I started seeing all these signs. I started seeing very similar messages. And I thought that it would be very important to remind people that history does repeat itself if we're not careful.
So this was a swing to the right in Polish politics about a decade ago. How has that all played out?
Well, now they have they swung back towards the middle, which is great after we left because I lived there for 4.5 years. But we're seeing the same message happening all over the world right now. So it's we saw a lot of it happen with Ukraine. My family was from Poland, my mother's family, but from Lvov, which is now Lviv, which is now Ukraine. So a lot of the headlines are the same. We're seeing them, and we're seeing it being played out right now in politics.
So what were some of the things that, I understand that abortion was made almost illegal. There was a crackdown on numerous other, issues. And the judiciary was changed fairly dramatically. Give me a sense of what you think some of those moves were that took place a decade ago in Poland that gave you the sense that it was potentially moving too far to the right and even potentially fascism.
So what happened is the government came in, and right away they made a very they increased their ties with the Polish Catholic Church. And so, of course, abortion right away they started to crack down on abortion. I was part of marches, big marches, and women who walked out of their jobs. And the other thing we saw very quickly is they took over the national TV and radio. So media suddenly was dampened, and only their message was getting out. And it's interesting because there's a very big square. There's a big monument in downtown Warsaw that is actually a memory to the censor's pen and all the censorship that happened. in the 1950s, for example. My father was involved with a lot of that, fighting that when he was in the theater there. And so they took over the media, and the media started to spew their ideologies and also the idea of the family first. So a man, a woman, and a few children. And I meant anybody else who had a different sense of family was right away not accepted. And I remember even during some of their marches on Independence Day for Poland is the same day as Remembrance Day for us here in Canada. And I remember they would tell people the big multinational companies that are there would tell everybody who wasn't Polish, stay home today, work from home today. Um, and those were absolutely terrifying. We actually landed in Poland after several days after November 11th, and we saw the aftermath of it. There were still police all over the streets. There used to be a square in Poland that had a giant rainbow, an art installation, and it was always nicknamed Burn the Rainbow Day because people would come out and burn that rainbow. And and it just started to get worse. If you weren't Polish, Catholic, you were being erased.
Now, the government has changed, but they're still a minority. So there's still a very strong part of Poland that supports that more right-wing effort, correct? And the president, I understand, still is of that ilk.
Yeah, he is. And of course, because people don't go away just because a government changes. They may be silenced a little bit more, there may be more controls, but even then, Poland would allow on those around that time, those holidays, for example, they didn't ban other right-wing fascist groups or neo-Nazi groups to come in. And so right away from neighboring countries, you'd see an influx of people marching through the streets and the full-on, we picture the skinhead, with facial face coverings and sort of the paramilitary outfits. And they're still around. They didn't go anywhere. Maybe their voices aren't as prevalent. They're not allowed to speak as loudly, but they're still there. They still believe it. My time in Poland, I knew when there was a rally, and there were rallies happening almost daily, I knew that if I saw the Polish flag or I saw the Euro flag, the European Union flag, I knew which side of the street to walk on. And it wasn't the side that had the Polish flag, because I knew that those were the right wingers that were probably standing on the opposite side of politics to where I was standing. So those were very clear signs, and those were throughout our whole time there.
And sorry, but you're comparing this to your family history from pre-World War II, as well as when your family had to leave Poland in, I think you said, the 1980s?
1968. So yeah, absolutely, because my mother's family is Jewish, and my grandfather wrote a memoir where the the words that he used were exactly the same that I was seeing now on the streets of Poland in 2013, 2014. And 1968, there was another big wave of Jews that left Poland because they were called the fifth column, and they left. And so that's when my family left. My grandfather was a member of parliament. And he was one of the first three members of parliament who were excused of their positions on the pretext that their kids were making trouble, and which in this case was my uncle. My mother at this point was studying in Paris, but yeah, my uncle went to jail, and my grandfather was relieved of his position, and blacklisted, so he couldn't get a job, and my family had to leave Poland, and that happened to thousands of Jews at that time. And my mother couldn't go back because she was told if she came back, she would probably go to jail as well. And so, yeah, my grandfather passed away in Toronto in 1985, and he was never allowed back into his country.
And this was 1968. What was the fifth column?
The fifth column were basically the Jewish people that were unwanted. That was President Gamuka at the time, and he had a big speech. It's quite famous, but he basically said that these were the people who didn't stand with Polish values, people who are unwanted. And he took it back and redacted it, but it's available. And they were just basically told that they weren't wanted because they weren't communists. They didn't want to be there. And ironically, my grandfather was a communist and he was part of the government. But because he was also a Jew, he was kicked out.
And you're saying this is similar to something that happened prior to World War II?
Yeah, so World War II, it was the same. I mean, it was the headlines are similar, right? The what we see in the newspapers are similar.
And prior in 1930s, Poland, was there anti-Jewish sentiment, or was that just something that came from Germany?
No, there was anti-Jewish sentiment in Poland as well.
I had occasion to go to Poland, southeastern Poland, and met a gentleman that was a retired police chief who was writing a book about his town and the history of his town. And I guess at one point in time it was half Jewish,
Mhm.
and today it was hardly less than 1% Jewish. And he wrote about the dramatic changes to his community, to his town, to the people that lived there, to the contributors to society, that their whole families had left or been forced to leave.
So Poland had one of the biggest Jewish populations in the world at one point. And there's still some. I write about that. We landed in Poland just before the holidays. So I was running around trying to find a menorah. I celebrate both Christmas and Hanukkah, and we are running around trying to find a menorah, and the only place that I could find one was at the store that's attached to the Nozhek synagogue, which is it still remains it's a pre-war synagogue, I think the only one in Warsaw, and we were greeted by a guard with a gun, and the gentleman sitting at the synagogue was sitting behind bulletproof glass. And when we asked if we could come and take a look, I had to surrender my passport and let him know that yes, I was Jewish. Um, so it's still there. There is a community, of course, but it's small and it's quiet. It's tight.
Help me understand after the incredibly bad, obviously bad's not an appropriate word, but experience of World War II and Auschwitz, etc. And then communist Soviet Union and what you were describing in the fifth column, 1968. Why would there still be anti-Jewish sentiment today? One would
You
think
know,
that people would learn from history.
but they're blaming the Jews now. And it's so ingrained in everyday speech, anti-Semitic slurs, that people don't even realize they're saying it. So my mother passed away in 1995, and at that point, my father said he wanted my sister and me to see where our roots were. That was my first time ever visiting Poland. And we went, and I remember when we landed, one of the first things we saw was graffiti, and it was the hangman with a Star of David on it. And even his family, my dad's side, my step aunt, I guess my uncle's second wife, she gave my sister and me crosses. And my dad even said, he's like, they're never going to wear those. That's not who they are. And it was this unimaginable idea that somebody isn't Catholic. I had friends in 2014 that I met who I could see they were shocked when I said I was Jewish, and that I probably was the first Jewish person that some of them had met, consciously met, where they knew that I was Jewish. And I think it's just so hidden, so not talked about, so not celebrated. It's changing. Now you can see their landmarks. The Poland Museum is really big now, and they're making a lot of noise. They're talking about the history of Poland, but I think it was just people are still angry. I went back in 2019 to visit family, and I happened upon the end of a protest, and it was a group of men standing behind me at a crosswalk, and they were saying, I cannot repeat it probably on air, but things about Jews and how the Jews are just taking, the government's giving the Jews all the money because Poland doesn't have the repatriation. So they won't, or not repatriation, but they won't give back they, 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 they won't give back, financial, and I'm drawing a blank on the word. I'm so sorry, but they won't give back the financials from the war. It's like Germany and other countries have.
Reparations.
Reparations. Thank you. I'm sorry about that.
So what, Poland was
They
providing
they don't
reparations?
they don't not in the same way that other countries
So
are.
why would they be objecting if they're not providing the reparations?
Because some of these things are tied up in court still, some property, and these gentlemen were very angry, and I was standing on the street corner with this group behind me who were saying really horrible things, and they're angry at the government, and so
This is a
um,
fascinating conversation, and a terrible one. I apologize, but it is. It's terrible to think that history does repeat itself. We're going to take a break and for some messages and come back with Carolyn in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We're chatting tonight with author Caroline Topperman is her name, and her book is about finding her history, her own family's history. It's called Your Roots Cast a Shadow: One Family's Search Across History for Belonging. It sounds like a really quite a fascinating but tough book, frankly, about how history repeats itself and how fascism, anti-Semitism, etc., has continued to rear its ugly head. Caroline Topperman is a European Canadian writer, entrepreneur, and world traveler. She was born in Sweden, raised in Canada, but with a recent stint of living in Poland. She holds BFA in screenwriting. She's the co-founder of Mountain Ash Press and KW Writers Alliance, and currently runs Migrations Review and Right They Said. Her book, Tell Me What You See, serves as a toolkit for her writing workshops, and she has written articles for Huffington Post Canada. Jane Friedman's blog, was the beauty editor for British Mode magazine, and served as the managing editor for Non-Binary Review. Her hybrid memoir, Your Roots Cast a Shadow, explores the explosive intergenerational histories that link war zones and foreign shores with questions of identity and belonging. Her next book, The Road to Tanjagura, integrates Afghan folktales and family memories with the story of one of the greatest roads ever built. Wow, pretty impressive background, Carolyn. I got to ask you, what's this non-binary review?
Oh, a friend of mine runs that now in California, and it was a great experience running that. It's international, and just different stories. There's different themes every month for every issue that goes out, and it might be something about family memories, and we accept anything from creative nonfiction to poetry, prose. Really wonderful experience working on that. Really great magazine. Some really great names have been published there too, which is really nice. If anybody is looking to get published, that's a really great place to start.
And you were the beauty editor? That sounds
No.
sort of different than everything else.
It isn't. It isn't. I used to work in the beauty and fashion industries a little bit as well. And I met somebody, it was online, and she decided to start a magazine. It was a spin-off of some other magazines out of the UK. And so I had this amazing opportunity to interview artists and jewelry designers, and and just write these fantastic articles about wedding venues and things I never thought I would ever write about, but it was a lot of fun,
Sounds
actually.
a lot different than what we've been talking about.
It really is.
So back to this current book, your roots cast a shadow, one family's search across history for belonging. You tracked your family since what, the 1930s?
Yes. So, and I'm trying to track them from before. I actually have been working with a genealogist in Poland as well. And because my family was in Ukraine, it's a little bit harder to track some of them. But yeah, that was when I started. That's when the story starts. Basically, my grandparents on both sides of my family. Um, you can only go so far in a book.
And they were Polish, but lived in what is currently Ukraine. So the Polish-Ukrainian border went back and forth hundreds of miles on several occasions, I understand. Were they Ukrainian as well, or no, they were Polish living in what's currently Ukraine?
Polish living in what's currently Ukraine. And my dad's mother was born in Kiev, but she was, which is also Ukraine, but was Polish as well. So the whole
Because I've
family
met
was Polish.
numerous families that are some portion Ukrainian and some portion Polish, and frankly, I met some families, lots of families that were some portion Christian Catholic and some portions Jewish, and so part of me was wondering why the Poles and the Ukes hated each other so much for such a long period of time and fought, and why there was such this degree of anti-Semitism where there was so much intermarriage.
Oh, I know. And it's hilarious because my husband, his family is Roman Catholic as well, but 100%, just even looking at some facial features and finding out about other members of the family, um, there's Jewish blood there as well. So yeah, it's a complete mix. And I don't know why people can't see that. There's no way living in that part of the world that people are just from one group. There's no way.
So I had a former mother-in-law who married a Ukrainian, and at the time, a couple of decades ago, the worst thing one could do as a Pole was marry a Ukrainian. Like it would the animosity between those two groups was intense, even though they lived side by side, and in the town they came from in Poland was half Ukrainian, half Ukrainian speaking, half Polish speaking. And today Poland is Ukraine's biggest supporter. Like, I don't understand it.
No, it makes no sense. I can tell you though, my grandmother, um, in an interview that she did not that long ago, she talks about her and my grandfather going back to just see the apartments that they left, the places where they had lived in Lviv. And she said that the people who were there wouldn't even let them in. They were probably afraid that here were, people coming back who wanted their homes back, but they wouldn't let them in. And I know that because of that, she carried that as well. Here she was. She had to flee for her life with just a knapsack. They fled all the way to Uzbekistan before coming back. My grandfather loved Poland so much that he basically he came back in 1944 to help literally rebuild the country. And here were these people who were completely expelling them. And I mean, I can only guess that it was out of fear, but that's why she didn't like it. She wanted nothing to do with that anymore.
So they fled Lvov prior to World War II, or at the beginning?
No, they fled so they left twice, but they were in Lviv, and then and I'm using Lviv just because it was still that city before the war. They fled, and they actually stayed until end of 1941 because it was under Russian occupation, and they could live under Russian occupation. So there were still quite a few Jews. The society was a lot more mixed at that time. And then it was only once the Nazis started coming through that they had to finally flee, and they had to get out because the front moves, right?
Thankfully they did.
Yeah.
Did any of your family end up in concentration camps?
So three-quarters of so most of my mother's family perished, were murdered. I I am currently trying to find out what happened to my grandmother's side. My grandfather, somebody in the family did a distant family, did the family tree. And I know some people did get out before the war. Some people left a lot earlier and they moved to the US. Um, but there was a chunk as well. I'd like to know what happened to his parents and then my grandmother's parents and her side.
And
Um,
yet, even after this experience, after the war, they moved back.
my grandfather loved his country. He loved Poland.
But not to the portion that became Ukraine, to Poland.
Yeah, he came back to Lublin, where that was where the initial government formed after in 1944. And then they lived in Stalowa Wola, a few other places, and then Warsaw. That's where they wound up because it was the capital.
Lublin is the town that I was mentioning was the subject of this person's writing that was one half Jewish at one point in time prior to World War II, and today less than 1%. Can you read us something from the book?
I can. You may have to tell me when to stop. I don't know how much time I have, but absolutely. This is from when I first landed in Poland. It's chapter 5. It's called Choinki and Menorahs, A Clash of Holidays in Warsaw. And choinki are Christmas trees. Hanukkah comes early in 2013, starting on November 27th. Most of our things are still in boxes somewhere on the ocean. It's at this moment that it hits me. Where do I buy a menorah and candles in a Catholic country? In Toronto or Vancouver, it was easy. But in Poland? I finally realized that the only place to find a menorah and candles is in the general store next to the Nożyk Synagogue on Twarda Street in what was once the Jewish part of town. Entering the courtyard, I feel the same way I do when I first see the boundary marker embedded in the sidewalk on Świętokrzyska Street, depicting the wall where the Jewish ghetto once stood. The friend I'm walking with, a longtime resident of Warsaw, admits it is the first time she has noticed the marker. I don't say anything, but I want to yell out at everyone mindlessly stepping over the metal plaque. Do you know what you just walked over? Do you know what happened here? How can you go about your day and ignore history? At least take a second to acknowledge it. This isn't about religion. It's more about humanity. I'm frustrated. I'm terrified that this is ignored. Why isn't more being done to educate the public? I know that there's a good chance that the Holocaust will be forgotten in the near future, and that will be dangerous for the entire world. I feel paralyzed with my thinking, and I'm not entirely sure what I can do to relay my fears to anyone who will listen. A uniformed soldier cradling a large gun stands guard out front. This is a very common sight around most European synagogues. The main synagogue in Berlin stands behind a 10-foot fence. The main synagogue in Florence has concrete barricades spanning a 6-foot perimeter around the entrance. Paris, Prague, Venice. If the city even has a synagogue, then it's most likely behind some sort of wall, populated with armed guards. Churches, on the other hand, are easily accessible with doors that are open to the public. We approach a man sitting behind a large glass wall. What do you want? Why are you here? Are you Jewish? I say that I am, and my husband is not. We have to hand over our passports, and with much skepticism, he allows us finally to enter. I am more welcome in the general store, and when the man behind the counter learns I'm in the market for a menorah, he is thrilled to show me everything they have. I also buy some candles and a few other treats that will get us through the holidays. As we leave, after he tells me that I'm always welcome, he says a few words in Hebrew. I smile and mumble something. I hope he doesn't guess that I have no idea what he said.
What a nice story. Thank you for sharing this. So after tracing your family history from pre-World War II in Ukraine and Poland to the departure of the forced departure of your grandfather in 1968 and the fifth column in Poland to your experiences today, what did you learn?
A lot. So, I mean, for me personally, it was really nice to learn about my family, just to understand some of their motivations in life, understand who they were. My grandparents my mother, for example, found out she was Jewish on the schoolyard. She didn't know. Her parents left all that back. So I grew up with a mother who was questioning a lot and trying to find her own connections. And luckily, my father was very supportive in all of that as well. But it was I saw this in a bigger way as well because I grew up in Canada. I grew up in Toronto, which is extremely multicultural. I grew up in schools that were extremely multicultural. I went to French schools, so we had groups from all over the world that were there. And it really taught me that you need to listen and that these stories connect us because a lot of my friends had similar stories. And a lot of my friends, for example, in high school had left the regime in Iran and couldn't go back to their country either. So I learned that especially that there are a lot of people out there with these similar stories that need to be shared.
We're going to take a break for some messages. I think that your story really does need to be shared. Remind us the name of the book and where we can find it.
So it's Your Roots Cast a Shadow, and it can be found at wherever books are sold.
We're going to take a break. Be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. This is a conversation I think touches a lot of people because I think, as Caroline has said, lots of us have these sort of shared ethnicities, shared religions, shared countries we come from, and have dealt with racism, sexism, anti-Semitism, fascism even. And as Caroline has said, regrettably, history repeats itself. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got an author with us tonight talking about her family's roots. Her name is Caroline Topperman, and her book is called Your Roots Cast a Shadow, One Family's Search Across History for Belonging. We haven't talked about that, Caroline. Why did they reach across history for belonging? Did they not? It sounds like your grandfather belonged in Poland, and that's why he went back. Why are they not feeling a sense of belonging?
So he did, but then, as we said, he was kicked out in 1968 and he wasn't allowed back. And so he tried to move to other countries where he felt good. He lived in Sweden for a little while. They lived in Germany for quite a long time, and then finally in Canada. And I think it was just this lack of keeping being reconnected with their roots. A lot of my family is in Germany right now. A lot of people weren't allowed to come back. We didn't talk about the other side of my family, but that other side survived the war in Afghanistan. This is a whole different show. But now I work with girls in Afghanistan who are having their voices silenced. And my father remembered that time very fondly because he became a political refugee just by staying with my mother. He couldn't come back to Poland either. The government took away their passports, and they never got their passports back until after the Iron Curtain fell and many years had passed, when communism was already abolished. And so I think that that's it. That's what it is. It was just always looking for the roots and staying connected to home.
So I want you to elevate for a second and talk about sort of history repeating itself and fascism, I guess. And that's one of the things. And you were saying that when we started out that you saw sort of this rise of fascism elsewhere in the world. We heard some of those comments prior to the election in the United States. Do you think fascism exists elsewhere in the world today? Do you think anti-Semitism exists elsewhere in the world today? And why, if so?
I think it does, absolutely. And it's everywhere. And why? I think people are afraid. I think they don't understand. I think they see it as, quote unquote, the other, and they don't understand. And I think people are fighting for, I think, I mean, this is probably a whole a whole other show, but yeah, no, it absolutely exists. And I think people don't really believe that it can happen here. I think that's the most dangerous um, thing. In North America, we've lulled ourselves into this belief that, oh, that won't happen here. That's somewhere else. And so we're allowed to walk down the street saying everything. I mean, there were Nazi symbols in Toronto, in Montreal last weekend. So, and nobody does anything. Nobody says anything. Nobody really stops it. And because of that, it bubbles. People are unhappy. You see this with youth in countries where they can't find jobs, where cost of living is high, and people are just unhappy. And that grows, and that sentiment grows, and it festers. And so you blame another group of people for that. And it just expands. And then history starts to
But we've
repeat
got some of the
itself.
lowest unemployment we've ever had in history.
Here, yes, but people,
The United States is even lower than here.
yeah, and I think they just, they just don't see it. They just don't see the connections.
So I
They
got to ask
don't
you a
see
question.
the.
One of my
Mhm.
sons was telling me that he went to school in Europe, and he had the Canadian flag proudly sewn on his backpack. And lately, he said he's uncomfortable with the Canadian flag now because he says that, if you see a Canadian flag on a pickup truck, it's got F one of the political leaders on a bumper sticker. It's sort of the Canadian flag has been taken over by one sort of a political group in Canada. You mentioned that if you saw the Polish flag on one side of the street and the Euro flag on the other, you knew which side had the Polish flag. You think about some of those rallies that we saw in the last couple of months in the United States where they were screaming USA, USA. That was one side of the political spectrum. When you talk about your book Belonging, is this a symptom of people wanting to belong, and so therefore they belong, but it's a very nationalistic, ethnocentric belonging?
I, yes, I think that that's people can't they don't really differentiate that. So we saw that in Poland, the big Polish marches, and it was this idea of nationalism, and we can't see that there can be lots of different groups together loving one country. And you have to think about it too. Canada and the US were probably the most multicultural countries in the world, right? Everybody else is nobody is quite like what we have here. And we're all trying to find our spot and our place and how we belong. And people are often coming from other countries, and my family included. I'm being very general, very broad here, but they're coming with different ideas. They've maybe been kicked out of their countries. They can't go back. They're not accepted. And so now you're coming to this place and you're trying to figure out, where do I belong? What happens here? What do I do? Who am I? And I think that we lose that sense of who we are if we don't know where we come from. And so you try to build something for yourself, but everybody's trying to do the same thing. And you can't often those things don't often reconcile, right? We don't have those conversations to see how they can all work together.
I read a fascinating book once. I can't remember the name of it, but it was about the history of genius. And it talked about those communities that have been the most prolific in innovation, whether it be in music or in politics or in economics or whatnot, were when diverse communities collided. And they talked about Vienna when you had freed Jewish and Austrians, and they worked incredibly well together. They talked about Protestants and Catholics in Scotland and some of the economic ideas that came forward. They talked about the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East when you had three religions that interacted on a regular basis. For some reason, diversity of opinion, of background, of race, of religion is incredibly beneficial, but we're not comfortable with it. Why?
I don't know. I think if I did, I could solve a lot of the world's problems right now. But I know in my industry, in the literary industry, there are blacklists, there are all sorts of petitions happening. Jewish writers are being sidelined and silenced. We know this has been happening. This has been playing out in the media. And, you know, somebody like Salman Rushdie, he's on a list of that was recently published that he should be boycotted. And this is a man that was silenced by his country and who's just trying to speak out to show people how wrong this is. So I don't know. It's a great question. I don't know, but something is broken right now, and I'm scared. I'm scared of what I'm seeing right now, of what's playing itself out right now.
You're scared.
I am.
Why? Do you think history's going to repeat itself again?
I don't know, but there's something volatile happening right now, and I'm seeing it play itself out quite publicly in my industry, but I'm seeing it everywhere. I'm seeing it on the streets of Toronto. I'm seeing it in the news. And I think we're deluding ourselves if we don't think that it can't happen here. What happened, you know, I don't know about it becoming a whole world war, maybe, but it's been getting worse over the last year or so. It's been at least the anti-Semitism, which is what I'm speaking to the most, but that's getting worse. And I see it. Even on social media, which I know is not something to follow really, but you can see it. You can see the tone, you can see the anger that people have, and that's just not being addressed. And people are getting angrier, and people are moving further, we'll say right, but they're moving further left or right. You know, I don't even know in which direction anymore. And the conversations are scary.
How do you solve? How do you combat? What do you do about anti-Semitism?
I think these are tough questions. I think you know, I think for us, it's just educating. It's educating, it's talking, it's standing together. You know, not every single Jewish person is the same, and we don't all believe the same things anyway. And I'm secular, so I have a very different upbringing, my whole life has been very different than somebody who's very religious, for example. But I think it's just finding those connections and finding those stories. And I think right now, that is the most important thing. We need to have those conversations open. We need to find connections with each other.
Caroline, thank you so much for joining us today and telling us about your thoughts about your book. It's Caroline Topperman, and the book is called Your Roots Cast a Shadow, One Family's Search Across History for Belonging. And I think, you know, reading about a family that had to depart Poland because of the Nazis coming in and losing a significant portion of your family to Auschwitz, but then still coming back, and then being forced to leave again because of anti-Jewish sentiment in 1968 and anti-Semitism, and then you coming back. You know, it's a fascinating story, and it's probably, regrettably, the story of a lot of families, and not just of Jewish families. As you point out, you know, similarities with people that have departed from Afghanistan, and we could go on. You know, my family got kicked out of the United States in the War of Independence in 1778, interestingly enough. I don't think there's any comparison, but they were tarred and feathered and had to march to southwestern Ontario. So you know what? There's lots of family stories that contain a lot of what you've been talking about. And so I look forward to reading your book, and thank you for writing it, and thank you for coming on today.
Thank you. It was my pleasure to speak with you.
We're going to take a final break and come back with a few concluding comments in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody.